Hi, welcome. In this video, I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about the issue of actually looking at certain problems as it relates to how things line up via the picture in the dog training world. And one of these things is, and again, any trainer has any amount of experience, will see how things don't always line up properly in the classroom. So, for example, dogs are going through the motions as you're building the picture, as you're incentivizing the dog, doing the sit, the down, the come, the stay, doing all the typical obedience things that define change. However, what's really common, and this is a thing that people really need to look at, and it's one of the issues I looked at many years ago, was when things don't line up through that picture. You know, when you look at that and say, okay, everything's going great in the classroom, it looked, tremendous, the person got their certificate, but they're still dealing with unwanted behavior issues and problems. I got this phone call from these people or whatever. What's going on? Is it, give it more time? Is it the timing's off on, when the person's rewarding the dog in the certain positions? Is it this thing about quadrants, 4 instead of 2? Is it, ultimately, is it the fault of the dog? Is it a genetic problem? What is it? And so here's the thing, I define this as kind of like a reverse engineering, okay, where you got to step back and you got to put pieces together. And so here's the thing, when you look at patterns, okay, when you start to look at the personality types of the people involved, okay, that's one of these dynamics, you'll see it. I ask certain questions, you start looking at how people think, and then you look at this issue, you go deeper than that, and look at this issue of response itself to say, well, is that right out of the starting gate, as you start to reward the dog and start to build the picture, is there more to that? I mean, is there something that underpins that? Or is it just about going through the motions, or is that, interpreting that, say, okay, does that define something meaningful through the response? Because, honestly, I mean, that looks great, right? But what's the end game here? I mean, honestly, what is the process? Is it, is it really a learning-based exercise, or is there something more going on? And the conclusion I came to a long time ago is there's something more, okay? There's more happening than just, what you see from the surface. So when these things don't line up, clearly, I mean, you have to define that. You have to, something's going to happen. Something's going to shake loose. The dog's going to get the blame or whatever. But here's the thing. Looking at all this stuff, when you start to kind of reverse engineer it, what you're going to find is there's a relational aspect here. It's all about approaching training differently as a relational changing process. Instead of just jumping into this whole learning-based, roadmap and start to work off, approaching training as such and incentivizing the dog that way, actually looking at the people. I mean, really identifying the personality types, but then beyond that, because there's certain things here that will give you kind of relational insight. It'll give you clues. There's numerous things that will say, okay, that's interesting. Okay, all these people are thinking the same, similar ways. You will see a gender aspect here too. You'll see a lot of, and this isn't meant to be a sexist comment, you'll see a lot of the people, and I'm talking like upwards of 90%, are going to be female. So again, that's interesting. It's not something to ignore or just write off as some sort of sexist thing to say, well, that's interesting. That's very high. But then beyond that, again, is not hover there for long, just to say, okay, there's clearly a relational aspect to this. There's depth here. There's more than just about going through the motions of response. What is the process itself? How do you actually get to a point of changing people? If that's the case, how do you approach the training process? And again, this is where I go right back to out of the starting gate, is approaching it as a relational changing process, because that's what's really happening, whether people realize it or not. Really, the starting gate is that it is that. But then how do you define that? How do you actually approach training? Well, again, what you'll see with my methodology is I'm not building the picture the same way. Okay, the interaction, you watch, closely how I'm interacting with the dog. I'm putting the dog in the position right near the person in the sit position, the heel type position. But that's a staging area. Okay, that's to create what I define as follower moments. Again, it's about what's again defining the type of influence. Okay, I make the distinction about that. It's about what's reasonable, the methodology. So you see how the leash is being used, but you'll see the dog's head turning in at certain points of these. I call them set points. So when people, ask me about quadrants and learning, well, it's different. It's what I define as these set points. So but it's part of the language of the method. So the language itself, it speaks, the methodology speaks language that the dog understands. So it's about what's reasonable. So, within the methodology itself, that's what defines and creates change. So there's a different setup of the picture frame by frame. If you watch how I'm doing it, it's very intentional. But what it does too, at the same time, it changes how people think. So the touching part, how the person's using or applying the methodology, speaking certain language. So it's kind of like an echo. It's changing how people think. It's changing how the dog perceives the person. And then the most important thing is it's actually dealing with the unwanted behavior issues and problems with how a dog's decision-making process is governed relationally at that level. And so it does all that. So what it does is the methodology itself does several things as you're beginning to advance through the scripting process. So anyway, just something to really think about when you look at, again, because I get a lot of questions about defining this. How do you, the nuts and bolts of it, how do you actually apply it? Well, again, it's applied differently. And so there's things within the relational system, the methodology, it makes it very distinct. It sets it apart, because right at the starting gate, it doesn't approach it the same way that, the majority of trainers approach training. But again, it's just like this concept of reverse engineering it. You have to look at what's going on, you have to ask certain questions, look at the people, then you have to really come to, arrive at a place where you're actually, your approach and how the methods themselves come together to create change. That's what's really critical, and that's what the system's about. So anyway, thanks for watching.